Hello, and a very warm welcome to this Guardian Live event. I'm Maya Wolfe-Robinson, one of the Guardian's North of England correspondents, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome all of you and our panel to this evening's discussion. We'll be together for 1 hour, and we really do have a stellar lineup of some of Britain's most thoughtful public intellectuals to discuss some of the themes of Dr. Kojo Koram's, here it is, Uncommon Wealth and how the British Empire continues to shape modern society. And in the book, Kojo really brilliantly lays out Britain's pretty outrageous treatment of its former non-white colonies and how that empirical legacy of greed and capital has shaped everything. And how we can use that learning to understand how privatized companies are running some of the cruelest bits of our immigration system, the collapse of the Red Wall, and Rishi Sunak's wife's non-dom status. So I hope we'll get into some of that tonight. Some of you have sent questions in advance to our speakers. Thank you so much for those. And if you would like to put a question forward at any point, just click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try and get through as many as we can in the second part of the hour. Brilliantly, there are more than 400 of you that have bought tickets tonight, so thank you. So we will definitely not be able to get through them all, but we will try our best to do some of them. If you require closed caption, you'll find this icon at the bottom of the screen too. So, to introduce our panel tonight, we've got Dr. Kojo Koram. He's a lecturer at the School of Law at Birkbeck College at the University of London. And before Uncommon Wealth, he was the editor of The War on Drugs and the Global Colour Line. We've got Ash Sarkar, senior editor at Novara Media, and she is also working on a book to be published next year called Minority Rule, so look out for that. And we've also got Emma Dabiri, a broadcaster, writer and academic who is the author of What White People Can Do Next, which was published last year, and Don't Touch My Hair. So, Kojo, do you want to kick us off? One of the kind of overarching themes of your book was the extent to which the legacy of empire went beyond some of the grounds that is more often covered. So those kind of traditional, was it good? Was it bad? What about the railroads type conversations? And then the legacy of racism, which has been a kind of, I suppose, a more recent mainstream conversation. We took it beyond that to lay out the financial, economic and legal implications for former colonies and for Britain that are still in place today. And one really fascinating example was how the Cayman Islands came to be what many people think about as one of the world's most notorious tax havens. And I just thought this story was so fascinating because I actually grew up in the Cayman Islands, and unlike the rest of the Caribbean, which is like a byword for like pina coladas and holidays, everyone knows that the Cayman Islands are kind of, you know, that's what they're known for. So everyone just assumes that my parents were some sort of kind of dodgy financial accountants or lawyers rather than just teachers that wanted to flee late 80s London with their small children. So yeah, could you just kick us off and tell us about Lyndon Pindling?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Maya. Of course, thank you to Ash and Emma and everyone who's joined us today to discuss empire, on an unexpected evening. So I think what I really try to do with this book was to extend the conversations that we've been having around decolonization over the last few years, away from the now more familiar culture war-like discussions around names of buildings and statues and decolonizing the curriculum, towards the kind of fundamental driving impetus of empire, which was, of course, material. It was financial. People don't get on a boat and sail halfway across the world in order just to be able to share some cultural delicacies with somebody else, to be like, oh, here's some Jane Austen you might want to read. No, it's about the extraction of resources and the transfer of it all across the world. And decolonization, which wasn't simply a metaphorical thing, but an actual historical experience in the 20th century, where 3/4 of the world transitioned from being colonial subjects into being independent nation states, is a serious element of our current global economic and financial system. And I think few places tell that story of the British Empire's economic aftermath better than the Cayman Islands, as you mentioned. And so we need to first of all remember that the Cayman Islands, along with some of the other leading, some people call them tax havens, they prefer to refer to themselves as offshore financial centers, places like the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, these three places named by the Tax Justice Network as the leading tax havens in the world. They are still British territories today. They are not distant, unknown Caribbean islands. They are still places whose ultimate sovereignty relies on Westminster. And the Cayman Islands were part of the British Empire. In fact, weren't even governed as an independent colony, but during the age of imperialism were governed as part of the colony of Jamaica, the much larger neighboring colony. And the way in which they transitioned from being these kind of forgotten backwaters of the British Empire into being these world-leading financial centers is through the role that they played in providing bolt holes, kind of hideouts for transnational capital wealth, particularly when they replaced places like the Bahamas as these new offshore financial centers. And so what happened during decolonization is places like Jamaica and places like the Bahamas started to elect nationalist leaders, often with quite stringent sovereign, politics based on a national sovereignty. And this is who Lyndon Pidling was within the Bahamas. He was a Black politician who became the prime minister, actually a childhood friend of Sidney Poitier. And even though his politics wasn't kind of explicitly socialist, because he kind of came to prominence through an incident where he went into the parliamentary chamber and seized the 165-year-old Speaker Mace and threw it out the window, he suddenly became seen as this representation of the kind of Black nationalist menace that was spreading across the Caribbean. And so a lot of the companies and financiers who were comfortable leaving their money in places like the Bahamas were now looking for a new safe haven where they could rest their finances. And the Cayman Islands started to separate itself from Jamaica as Jamaica became an independent country. The Cayman Islands started to get its first constitutions passed through, which allowed it to become this new thing that we call the British Overseas Territories, this kind of half in, half out of the British nation state. And that allowed them to be able to present themselves as still reliable, places where people could leave their money, leave their blind trusts, leave their secret trusts, because they're still part of the English common law system. They still have ultimate sovereignty of Westminster. They still have the monarchy as their head of state. They still have all of that expertise and that close connection to the City of London. But they're also outside the British state in terms of not being beholden to the same tax demands, not being beholden to the same regulation that the actual metropole of the British island relies upon. And so over the course of the early 1960s to the early 1980s, the Cayman Islands passed a wave of legislation that encouraged companies from around the world to set up prominence within their actual jurisdiction. In fact, the number of companies registered in the Cayman Islands increased by nearly 400% just between 1970 and 1976. They also really benefited from London becoming the center of what was known as the euro dollars market. And if I could just explain that very briefly, following the Second World War, there was an imposition of kind of capital control across the movement of money across borders, and the City of London, using its kind of imperial connections, presented itself as the place through which, if you wanted to take your money offshore and you wanted to have American dollars, but not have them accountable to the capital controls and regulations of the American system, you could pass them through the City of London and ultimately into these overseas territories like the Cayman Islands. So the Cayman Islands became home to over $30 billion of euro dollars by 1980 and became one of the centers for what we know as the emergence of neoliberalism and the decline of kind of national sovereignty and national control over the economy. And so when we try and think about questions of decolonization, and this has often happened recently, they end up being separated from issues around wealth inequality, issues around the precariety of employment, issues around the left behind, or the people who are really struggling at the front line of society. We need to recognize that that is not divorced from the history of empire, but wholly connected to it.
Right. Thank you so much for laying all of that out. And obviously, one of your arguments is that by studying these material effects, not only tells us about those overseas territories as you've just laid out, but also you mentioned the City of London there and the role of the Euro millions in the 70s. But it can also tell us about the City of London today and how it's still remains, or perhaps until, you know, in the last few months, a magnet for Russian oligarchs or billionaires from all over the world. And so maybe Ash, you could kick us off here. How does this kind of framing, as in kind of looking at the financial and economic systems, help us tackle questions about inequality in Britain today and the kind of implications for our democracy?
I mean, this is a hugely important book for understanding why it's so hard for politicians and for electorates to feel like they've got any meaningful grip on the economy. All right, why it always seems to be this external thing, which is, you know, bigger than us, and you can't control what the markets do. It's not subject to, you know, normal political rules like anything else. And I think that this book is so important for making sense of all of that. Because one of the things that really struck me when I was reading Kojo's book is that what the British Empire was a system of white collar crime backed up by genocide. And that was something which was happening, you know, across the empire. There are these wonderful stories that, you know, Kojo relays, such as, you know, how Singapore came into British hands in the first place. It's because like this dude, Stamford Raffles, just went over there and like did some skullduggery. Like it was all sleight of hand and fraud, and how that runs against, you know, the British sense of fair play, the civilizing mission, the introduction of law and property rights and various kinds of, you know, constitutional norms, you know, that really starts to crumble under the first slightest bit of examination. And I think that's really important for understanding where we are now. So it's not just a sense of these are historic wrongs that they happened, and to understand ourselves, we need to understand the past. No. It's something which is really central to the current crop of leaders that we've got right now. So one of the great arguments for Brexit, of course, was that it was about reclaiming the sovereignty which had been ceded to the European Union. And one of the things that this book sort of lays bare is that, well, the European Union wasn't really where most of the sovereignty got ceded. It didn't even really get ceded. What happened was that after empire ends and Britain goes, holy shit, we need an economic hinterland. What are we going to do? There's two things. One, it's like, please, Mr. de Gaulle, will you let us join this common market that you've got? And then the other thing it does is that it sets up all of these, you know, offshore jurisdictions where dirty money can hide quite nicely without ever having to be sullied by touch of the British taxpayer. Right. And that's something which happens immediately. And of course, it makes life in this country worse for people, because you can see that there's an elite. You can see it's an elite which benefits from the labor and resources of this country and the labor and resources of other countries, that it buys up property here, you know, sending up the cost of living for everybody, and yet the tax money isn't coming here. Right. It's totally corrosive to the body politic, to any sense of a social contract, right? It's so bad. But what this elite also worked out is that if you misdirect the anger, right, you direct it elsewhere to other institutions or to other sections of society, you can get away with a scam forever. And it totally, it didn't really blow my mind in like it was a surprised way, but I was sort of shocked by the gumption. Open Democracy did a report on Richard Tice, who was the Brexit Party chairman, and had a little look into his finances. He had all these connections to, you know, these family businesses, which then had, you know, the largest shareholders were all based in Panama or based in the British Virgin Islands. So you don't really know who these largest shareholders are. I put these questions to him once, and he denied all knowledge of these companies. And then it turned out that he personally sold one of these companies a valuable property for $10, right? So I think that anyone could take a look at that and go, okay, in some way, he's benefiting from offshore tax arrangements. And that's quite central to how his family businesses are making their money. And yet he's the guy out there with Nigel Farage talking about take back control, talking about all the money that goes to the EU. And yet he is, you know, up to his eyeballs in offshore tax arrangements which preserve his wealth from the British taxpayer and from paying into British public institutions. And it's not just something which is, of course, unique to the Brexit Party. You know, Rishi Sunak and his wife, you know, his billionaire wife, who has got, you know, is registered as you know, a non-domiciled UK resident. He himself has a green card, you know, which means he's ready to go to California and, you know, wear turtlenecks and work for Apple or whatever at like the drop of a hat. You know, the way in which our elite is enmeshed with these offshore systems of hiding tax, it goes right back to the days of empire. And so I think that this is one of the things which is really important about the book, and something that I didn't quite understand before I read it, is that the politics of empire get wrapped up. You get this sort of like nominal political autonomy, but the financial arrangements just fade into the background. And one of the tricks is to make it sound so boring, right? To make it sound like, oh, this is just techie, bureaucratic nonsense. Oh God, you know, you don't want to be a bean counter, do you? That right under our very eyes, our democratic control of the economy has been stolen from us, right, in broad daylight, and we don't even know that a crime's taken place.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. So to what degree does economic illiteracy, or just the way that my eyes glaze over whenever anyone talks about certain kind of financial arrangements, took me a while to understand, you know, basic things like a mortgage. How much does that sort of influence the way in which there isn't an outcry about this? Or is it actually, you know, a lack of knowledge in a willful way? I wondered if, you know, all three of you have written about the way in which race and class intersect, and how anti-racism struggles shouldn't be separated, or there is a way in which you don't separate those struggles from tackling capitalism. And Emma, this was a kind of one of the themes of your book, What White People Should Do Next, kind of laying out the difference between allyship and coalition, in which you argue that finding solidarity with the shared roots of oppressions can be a better model to achieve racial justice. It would be brilliant if you could kind of expand on that a little. And all of you, I think there's a sort of element of agreement here, an overlap. But are you saying that it's kind of wrong to focus on pulling down statues of enslavers like Colston, and we should just focus on, you know, what all of these privatized companies are up to?
So I think like narrative is extremely important. And if you look at the kind of distinction between what Ash has just described about how that tendency, you know, to think about the economics, or Maya, as you've been saying, to think about mortgages, it's boring, you know, it doesn't tend to grab most people's attention. And if you think about the way the conversations about decolonization have become untethered from economics or from material conditions, and have become almost completely in their entirety focused on identity and on kind of, you know, identity politics, to use that fraught term. And I think about both of the books that I wrote, like I slightly cringe when I hear their names. And certainly it's not that I was for it, but it's not that I was, like, you know, forced to have those names. I chose to go with them, but it was to actually, even though those books are, you know, kind of about the redistribution of resources, about economic systems, about material conditions, even the first book about hair, I chose to go with names that tap more into the kind of zeitgeist of identity politics, because it can introduce those ideas to people, you know, that would otherwise perhaps, you know, not so easily engage with them, not so quickly engage with them. And I think what is so, like, I love Uncommon Wealth so much. So Kojo, just like, you know, I've been gassing this book like so much as I've been reading it. It's so profoundly brilliant. And one of the many things that I think is so fantastic about it is, similarly to what I try and do and what white people can do next, is to the way that I try and demonstrate that whiteness is not just detrimental to racialized minorities. It's also detrimental to the earth itself, but also as a system, not just as a racial identity. But it's also detrimental to people who are racialized as white. And I think when we frame it in that way, we can actually build a more compelling argument to bring more people on board, you know, to kind of interrogate whiteness. And what happens, what Kojo does in Commonwealth is, you know, really similar. It's saying that, like, you know, these processes of empire, imperialism, processes of colonialism, the corporatization, you know, of public services, the outsourcing of everything, the introduction of private property, all of this like contract law, all of these things that were introduced throughout they were enforced, rather, let's be real, throughout the world via the imperial project, also came to be how like everything operates in this country as well, and are, you know, essentially equally detrimental. I don't know about equally, but, you know, are also very, very damaging to British people, to ordinary, not necessarily the elites, but to everyone else other than the elites. So rather than framing, you know, decolonization again like allyship as this kind of plead to be a good person, you know, to support the to kind of support the racialized other or victim, actually showing people in no uncertain terms, showing like white British people how they also are victims of this imperial project. And I think that's just absolutely genius. And yeah, it's such an important book.
Thank you. Yeah, I love the overlap in both of those things from both of your work. And so I guess just to kind of follow up on the question about, is it therefore wrong to focus on these kind of symbols like statues, or, I mean, there's been another kind of debate about flags, I think, today, but these kind of debates pop up a lot about various kind of symbols. And, you know, is it wrong to focus on those? Was pulling down Colston the wrong thing to focus on?
Well, at least for me, I would say, I mean, no, I don't think the pulling down Colston was wrong at all. I mean, I think that if you can go through your life walking through Bristol and not have to walk through a statue of a former director of the Royal African Company, that's a good thing and should be done. And, you know, obviously the people who pulled down the Colston statue took great personal risks and have been really vilified in terms of, you know, what they did. But I don't think that that should be the end of the conversation. And I think that we do want to be wary of how it can become comfortable terrain for those who want to suppress the entire conversation around empire to simply talk about the symbolic and the cultural elements of it. And so when you think about, you know, like you say, some of the other debates that came in the aftermath of the pulling down of the Colston statue, debates around, you know, is Rule Britannia going to be sang at the last night of the proms? You know, that was a big debate that Jacob Rees-Mogg was very comfortable arguing about that. You know, he stood in Parliament, he played Rule Britannia in defiance of the woke mob at the BBC who were trying to suppress the playing of Rule Britannia, even though nobody actually said they were going to do that. This is a completely manufactured culture war story. But he's very comfortable talking about flags. He's very comfortable talking about pictures of the Queen at common rooms. He's very comfortable talking about Rule Britannia and last night of the proms. He's not very comfortable talking about offshore financial centres. He's not very comfortable talking about overseas territories and the way in which Britain had become that gateway to the offshore financial world through the legacy of empire. So I think we can push the conversation, not to say that, not to dismiss or to, kind of minimize the symbolic potency of things like the pulling down of the Colston statue. You know, that is a totemic moment in the history of Britain's recognition with its imperial past, but that is not going to change in and of itself the material basis of the way in which this country functions. And if we do simply engage with, you know, the legacies of empire at the National Trust and legacies of empire at the last night of the proms, we can fall into the pattern of allowing those who want to dismiss the conversation about empire to say, well, this is simply of interest to the intellectual chattering classes. Yes, if you want to be a good person, like Emma was describing, you know, you can care about, you know, slavery statues of people who were 400 years ago. But if you're concerned with the cost of living crisis, if you're concerned with the left behind, if you're concerned with the corporatization of the economy, you don't have time to be worrying about all of this. But I think, we need to remember that Edward Colston wasn't simply a racist and a slave trader. He was also the director of one of the most successful kind of private corporations of the early years of the British imperial project. And so the role it played in the corporatization of the British economy is also part of the Colston story and should be continued when we think about him.
Okay, so you're just like, they pulled it down for the wrong reasons. Oh,
no, yeah, I think they pulled it down for the right reasons. It's just there's further that we can talk about those other parts of Colston too. But I also think, just if I could extend to that point as well, I think part of the big backlash that the right gave to the pulling the Colston statue was to try and squeeze it into identity politics and say, well, why is it that all these young white kids are pulling down a Colston statue? Why should they care about the history of racism? You know what I mean? Apologies for stay very loud motorbike in the background, but trying to squeeze it into these. I think that was Jacob Rees-Mogg trying to shut me down there in the conversation. But the idea of trying to squeeze it into those identity politics without thinking about, well, if we talk about the role in which the Royal African Company and after it the Royal Niger Company and after it the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company played in the triumph of the corporatization of the economy in the United Kingdom, why wouldn't young millennial kids whose lives have been devastated, whose living standards have been eroded by the way in which the neoliberalization of the British economy has meant that the asset prices have escalated way beyond the ability for people to actually reproduce their lives, why would they feel any allegiance to someone like Edward Colston just because he's supposed to be a representation of British imperialism? And so I think by moving on to this materials basis, we can start to push against that kind of identity politics way in which people like to talk about empire.
I was wondering if I could jump in. Also, apologies for all the banging in the background. My cat tried to jump on my lap and smacked his head on the desk. So he's just been wailing in the background. I mean, just to sort of add to this question of identity, I think that there's the identity politics of who am I and who are you and how do we get down to these irreducible differences, which I think can sometimes be very corrosive to the project of movement building and solidarity. And then I think that there is the question of identity and how it also shapes movements. And that might sound like the same thing, but it's kind of not. I think one of the reasons why the Colston moment was so powerful is because it did make people feel like they were a part of something. They're a part of a community based on values which rejected having the presence of a slaver in the middle of their city being celebrated in this statue and in the names of schools and music halls and all the rest of it. And I think that just as much as that moment is a project of wanting to feel a sense of political community, in other ways, so is, the kind of fantasies involved in Brexit in terms of what this is going to bring back, what that's tying you to in terms of what you think that country, what the country is. And I think that those forms of imagined political community are really important, but that's not the same as your demand, and that's not the same as the thing that you actually want to achieve. So I think you can have these flashpoints which, are cultural in some way, because culture is important. Culture it's like a lens, and it can either clarify your perception of reality or it can cloud and distort it. And I think culture will always be an important part of anti-racist movements, but you can't confuse that for the demand, for the goal.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to discuss the kind of recent royal visits that we've seen to the Caribbean. So the Caribbean has been in the news through the lens of the royal visit in the last month or so, which started with the royal visit from the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, Will and Kate, to Jamaica, Belize and the Bahamas. And the intention behind it was reportedly a kind of a charm offensive to stop these countries following in Barbados's lead in removing the Queen as the head of state. And we can probably all agree that wasn't particularly successful because they were met with protests in all three places, and Jamaica confirming that it would begin to take those steps to becoming a republic. And then there was a visit from the Wessexes to Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And again, similar plans to become republics were announced. So I'd love to hear all of your views on that. But I'd also like to contrast it with another story that is getting kind of less coverage, despite being a British overseas territory, the British Virgin Islands, as discussed earlier, where, so to give the background, there's been a corruption inquiry, which was led by a British retired judge, recommended, and this inquiry recommended that the constitution be suspended for 2 years, the elected ministerial government system be ceased, and direct rule by a UK appointed governor be implemented. And then meanwhile, not directly linked to this inquiry, the Premier was arrested on drug trafficking charges in Miami, which led Liz Truss, our Foreign Secretary, to call for urgent action. So I think there's two really interesting things going on there. Who wants to start us off?
Well, I can, jump in with some initial responses. I was probably one of the very few people who would align themselves with the kind of political left in the United Kingdom who was loving the pictures of the royals when they went over to the Caribbean, because I was like, this is what I was talking about. Look at what they're doing. I was like, I thought about sending Wills and Kate maybe a little thank you card, but thought they might not appreciate it after all. But I think, the way in which the response towards the widespread protests and kind of rejection of the royal family when Wills and Kate went to the Caribbean was very much reported as though, again, this is something that's tied to kind of decade-long racial resentment that's been bubbled up through Black Lives Matter. And then now we have these Caribbean islands who, 5 years ago were absolutely fine with the current constitutional setup and, were grateful for having the Queen and would wave Union Jacks when they came through, and all of a sudden now they're being, just so mean and so horrible and rejecting the, the British Crown, which had done so much for them after all those years.
The natives have been riled up.
Exactly, this idea that, that somehow they've had their minds turned against. This is a lot of the discourse that happened around the formal era of decolonization, which is a world transformative era. We just tend to forget about it here in the United Kingdom. And so the way in which this was again talked about as though it's simply a symbolic thing. This is, having the Queen as the head of state, it's just a symbolic thing. It's just, a hangover of imperial niceties. It's not something that really influences the legal, political, or economic setup of somewhere like Jamaica. I think we know so little about what having a constitutional monarchy that extends across a former imperial realm actually means. It means, impacting not only Jamaica's military, not only Jamaica's economy, but things like its legal system. We don't recognize, I think, in the United Kingdom, that the highest court in the land of places like Jamaica, and especially in places like the overseas territories like the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands, is still the Queen's Privy Council, one of the most shadowy bodies of Britain's constitutional makeup. It'd take a long time to explain, but essentially the Queen's private advisors. And if you go to court in Jamaica, and then you go to the Court of Appeal, and you go to the Court of Appeal after that, eventually your last chance of justice will be a direct appeal to the Queen of England. Like, that is something that is going to have massive impact in terms of the way in which this country continues to function. And so the role in which elements like the monarchy, elements like the Privy Council play in these supposedly long, distant, tropical Caribbean paradises that we know so little about, despite the fact that Jamaica remains one of the most popular holiday destinations for British people in the world. We know so little about the fact that, the constitutional relationship between Jamaica and England, at least, actually predates the constitutional relationship between Scotland and England. England had Jamaica as a colony prior to the establishment of the Acts of the Union in the early 18th century. And so this is a centuries-long system that has influenced the way that Jamaica's come into being. And when people are recognizing and trying to challenge against that, what they're trying to do is to think about what kind of country do they want to be in the 21st century. I think that does contrast very briefly with what we see going on in the British Virgin Islands, where we now have be the decision by the UK government that they want to take a more interventionist role in the British Virgin Islands because of this DEA sting of the current premier. It's interesting that this kind of interventionist action wasn't seen as necessary by the British government when we had the release of things like the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers that spoke explicitly about the role that the British Virgin Islands and these offshore territories play in the growing financial inequality within our current global economic system. We know that Westminster is willing to intervene in British overseas territories when it feels it suits its political objectives, as the Chagos Islands, which had people expelled off their territory in order to create a military base for the United States, as the Turks and Caicos Islands as well. But over the last 40, 50 years, where these places have become these bolt holes for financial wealth, where we know that, the oligarchs of the world, at the start of the year, we were all talking about, why are all these oligarchs in London? What do you think it might be about London? Do they really like Madame Tussauds? Is that why they've come to London? No, it's because of the role the City of London plays towards being the gateway to this financial offshore world, such as the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands. This history that was never seen as a motivation for the UK government to take an intervention and to try and, resolve in the way these overseas territories functioned. It was very comfortable with that. It was very happy for Britain to play that role in the world, but only when there is a DEA sting around a drugs charge, now it's seen as though there might be a suspension of the constitution and there might be an attempt to try and reform how these countries function. And so I think it's, again, trying to get people to try and understand that the allegiances that the British elite and the elite that really benefited from imperialism aren't the same as the interests of everyday people who are trying to, deal with the cost of living crisis, deal with paying their bills, deal with being able to have some sort of security in their life. Those are very different when we talk about the legacy of empire.
Could I ask you a question very quickly, Kojo?
Sure.
As I was listening to you talking, and you were talking about, earlier this year, everyone suddenly acts very surprised that Roman Abramovich owns Chelsea Football Club. They're like, how did all of this Russian money get here? And that connects to what, Oliver Bullock says in his book about Britain having become butler to the world. So we've become the destination for, every despot's dirty money. And I suppose maybe the thing I wanted to ask you is, does, Britain and British overseas territories' role in offshoring other people's money, is that a loss of status for the British elite, or is it a way of preserving that status?
I think that's a really, really good question, because it really does speak to the role that Britain presented itself in the aftermath of empire. In a way, it definitely is a loss of status to transition from being a global hegemon to being, the kind of apex of imperial ideology of, Britannia ruling the waves and, the pound being the reserve currency of the world. So, the fact that there has been that shift and you do have the rise, first of the United States and then of China and these other economic superpowers does seem to suggest a kind of loss of political power in the world for the United Kingdom. But in terms of the role that the UK plays in the facilitation of the triumph of neoliberalization, and like I said, the escape of the asset economy from the anchoring of everyday national sovereignty, which happens first and worse in the decolonized world. It's not that it's equal. For me, I like to think of it like what happens in the decolonized world happens first and worst, but it's going to come back here as well. If you're, a billionaire who's able to transition wealth across different jurisdictions, you might be like, I don't want to pay tax in India, and I don't really want to pay tax in the UK as well. Actually, I'm comfortable with not paying tax in the UK. And so the role in which the UK played in this emergence of neoliberalism, I think, is a really undertold story when we talk about the triumph of financialization, when we talk about, as the kind of Brexit moment tried to kind of speak towards, but then, as you mentioned, I think so astutely, redirected it towards the EU and immigrants, talk about this feeling of a loss of control. We're no longer able to determine how our economy functions. We're no longer able to control how these companies function within our jurisdiction. This is the role of the United Kingdom in the aftermath of empire, and the way in which the financial train tracks we often talk about, the railways, as you mentioned earlier, Maya as being the legacy of empire, but the financial train tracks that extended to Singapore, to the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, have played in that neoliberalization of the world, I think is a key part of Britain's story over the last few decades.
Could I ask you a question as well?
I love it. Everyone's just asking all the questions.
There that I have you. So you talk about, the first part of it is, with all the divesting from the Commonwealth, say every country was to do that, without there being a remodeling of the global economic system, how can that be translated into something that actually impacts positively on the ordinary person in Jamaica or in any of these countries? And secondly, and kind of related, in the book, you talk about how the independence of Ghana, the first independent African nation, was essentially achieved through a labor strike organized by Nkrumah. And what do you think is the role of labor organizing in this kind of remodeling of, what do you think is the role of labor reorganizing in this moment? And why do you think it kind of is so there's so little kind of discussion, so little discussion of anything to do with labor within conversations about decolonization or kind of social justice issues presently?
No, I think again,
just quickly before Kojo answers that, I'm just going to remind everyone to send in your questions, please, and we're going to move on to audience questions just as soon as you've answered Emma's two really brilliant, thought-provoking questions.
Well, thank you for those. Yeah, again, I think that really touches upon a lot of the heart of the book, and what I try to do in kind of retelling the story of decolonization, which, like I mentioned, is something that really is, erased from our kind of our purview here in the United Kingdom, despite the UK being the main character in the story of 20th century decolonization. When all these countries from Nigeria to Ghana to India to Jamaica celebrate their independence days, there's another main character in that story that often is the United Kingdom. And yet we know so little about that. I tell a little story in the book of Tony Blair, just brief diversion, Tony Blair going to facilitate the transition of Hong Kong back to China, and explicitly mentioning that he had no idea when the Chinese premier was talking about the Opium Wars. He was like, I had no idea what he was talking about. That is something that if we had a French prime minister talking about how he had no knowledge of Waterloo, we'd think that that's completely ignorant. And so by retelling the story of decolonization, what I wanted to do was to talk about a lot of what failed and what wasn't able to actually transform the material relationships of society. And a big part of that was the reinforcement of transnational capitalist wealth using those kind of the architecture of the British imperial state. But a lot of it was also some of the leaders of those decolonized countries. You mentioned Nkrumah at the start there, somebody who was able to achieve independence through mobilizing a large scale labor strike, using some of the already implemented kind of gender and communal networks that were in place in Ghana at the time, in order to be able to spread that kind of mass organization that the British government didn't think was possible at that time. When he becomes the actual first prime minister and then president of Ghana, he starts to move away from that more laborist and that more socialist politics. And I mentioned a little bit at the end of the book when I talk about the kind of lack of optimism that my grandfather had at the time of celebrating kind of 50 years of Ghanaian independence, that what happened with the national liberation struggle, as it was talked about then, was that we started ending up with a lot of nationalism and a very little bit of liberation. And I think that we can see that with Nkrumah, we can see that with a lot of the other potential leaders of that decolonized moment. And I think that's something that we want to learn about when we're talking about decolonization now in 2022, that we do need to think about organizing labor internationally, because capital is international. It's more international now than it was even in the 1950s and the 1960s. At the press of a button, we can move wealth and change lives and erase jobs from Singapore to the Cayman Islands to Lagos to London, all the way to South Shields. This is all possible through the transnational network of capital. And we need to try and move away from thinking about labor within our own kind of national silos. And this is what I tried to do in the book, is to try and think about how can we create the framework for a new internationalism, because we know that the crisis we're going to be facing in the 21st century, from climate change to migration crisis, to the escalation of wealth inequality, to maybe further pandemics, they're all going to be international. And if we don't have an organized labor movement across borders, we're not going to be able to have the kind of fight back that we need.
Thank you. So we've had a few audience questions along the same lines about reparations. So Cheryl Martin asks, do you think Great Britain should pay reparations to those formerly enslaved within its empire? And Liz Rothschild on the same theme says, how do you envisage creating a system that would lead to repayments, as has been done for Jews from Germany in the form of restitution money? So I guess maybe, Emma, we could come to you first. Try as really briefly as we can sort of say whether we should be moving to a system of reparations. And also I think it's worth figuring out, what are we talking about reparations as in individual payments to individuals who are descended from enslaved people, or are we talking about a system of reparations which is state to state in the way that CARICOM, the network of Caribbean countries, has envisaged, which is more about the European countries that were involved paying amounts of money to the countries, and then that filtering down, sort of like a kind of the aid, an aid system. Emma.
Yeah, I think it's really important to be specific as to precisely what it is we're talking about, reparations to whom and for what and what form they take. And if you look at the kind of 10-point plan or demands of CARICOM, it's not asking for individual handouts or payments to the descendants of slaves. It's actually it's an entirely reasonable redistribution of resources. And that's what needs to happen. And if you look at say the United States, if there was a redistribution of resources and in the United States, where you have the afterlife of slavery that is so apparent in there's such spatial segregation in terms of where people live, the schools, that the kind of legacy of kind of recent redlining policies of Black Americans having access to being able to purchase homes, the quality of schools in many of those areas, which is linked to taxes. There's such a spatial segregation that it seems, and obviously there's everything that exists, with healthcare and the extortionate insurance. I've just been in the States for the last few months, so this is all very feels very feels very present. But I think if there was a redistribution of resources and the society was actually made more equal, there probably wouldn't even need to be reparations in the first place. And I'm not sure where I sit in it. I have heard the argument made that reparations is not a help in the United States. That reparations is not a helpful tactic towards building a politics of solidarity and coalition, which I think has a lot to say for it, which I think is a very valid point. And yet there is a clear discrepancy, with kind of how many Black Americans have access to wealth and resources and others. But then of course there's loads of impoverished white people, there's loads of impoverished people in the United States. So yeah, I think kind of looking more wholesalely at some sort of redistribution of resources is what needs to happen. That needs to happen, urgent.
Thank you.
Okay.
No, go on, Kojo. Do you want to do a really quick answer? But bearing in mind, we've only got 10 minutes and I want to get through some more audience questions.
Very quick, yeah. I think that, coming, for my sins, teaching law school, and in terms of kind of legal provision, reparations isn't a particularly controversial thing once you move out of the emotions of it. It's been distributed, and not just in the German example that people are familiar with, but Canada with the indigenous schools. We know that there was a German payment to the Herrera. There's so many different examples of this, but I do think that there's also a question of the way in which payment can function not as an opening of historical understanding, but as a closure of historical understanding, seen as, well, we've given these people their payment, and so we don't need to worry about ongoing structural inequalities. We don't need to hear about that anymore. We've given them the money. Can't they just show? And one of the few examples of British compensation that's happened through the kind of private tort law rather than through international law and reparations, but one of the few British payments to survivors of colonial violence is to the Mau Mau survivors of the torture of that they suffered, including castration, during the uprising in Kenya. And that didn't open up public understanding. What actually happened is, once the British government realized they were going to lose that case, they quickly were like, here, there's a quick 20 million, please go away and don't ever bring it up again, because we don't want everybody to know about what happens. And so I think if we are talking about reparations, I think, like Emma said, you want to think about structural transformation of the economy, not just quick payments that can allow the closure of history.
I mean, if I could add to that, I think two things, because I agree with everything that both Emma and Kojo have just said. One would be cancel third world debt, because not only has that been something which is, driven people into poverty and kept them there, but two, debt has been the pretext for structural readjustment programs, which are to the benefit of elites in those countries and elites in our countries, and to absolutely nobody else. So I think that that's one very easy thing that rich countries can do almost overnight. The second thing is seeing things within a context of climate change and climate justice. And I think about this particularly with regards to Bangladesh, which is where, my family are from, which is hugely vulnerable to climate change. You're already seeing massive levels of salinity intrusion, which is when the salt water kind of like contaminates the fresh water. You have huge rates of arsenic poisoning because of all the dams which are having to be built in order to keep out the seawater, and then the arsenic seeps into the drinking water of Dhaka. And the impacts of climate change are being felt right now. And I think that when we talk about, climate action, we sometimes, we just think like about what it's like here. And actually, one of the things that we need to think about more is how climate change can totally fit in with the goals of economic justice. If you are to share climate-friendly technologies such as offshore wind, onshore wind, solar panels, if you waive the intellectual property rights, not only are you saying, okay, we're going to stop pumping carbon into the atmosphere, and it helps these countries which tend to be formerly colonized countries and also are hugely vulnerable on the climate vulnerability index, but it also gives them an opportunity to develop economies which aren't based on fossil fuels or just horrendous exploitation of their native populations. So yeah, wipe the debt, solar panel everything. Those are my two suggestions.
And just very quickly, hearing Ash talk about the waiving of intellectual property rights, like to kind of for people to have access to this technology, goes back to that. That's kind of the type of decolonization that the book is arguing for. If we think about property rights as being imposed all over the world through the imperial project.
Thank you. Really super quickly, because I want to try and squeeze in just two little questions before we wrap up. Someone in the audience has sent in a question, thoughts on Douglas Murray's book, The War on the West, which seems to be arguing that any discussion like this is an attack on Western culture. I don't think we've got time to get into Douglas Murray or his book, but I wondered if you just had some brief thoughts about how you don't get distracted by the ways in which people want to kind of frame these kind of discussions as an attack on Western culture or as unpatriotic in other ways.
I mean, look, posh Tommy Robinson can suck eggs as far as I'm concerned. I'm not worried about what he has to say about any of us.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely second that, but also
The Guardian.
I would definitely, but also I would, what he's trying to do, and this is what a lot of the kind of backlash to try and repress decolonization was something that only people, another author, Matthew Goodwin, talks about how outside of the Twitter sphere, and university campuses, nobody cares about decolonization. What they're trying to do is to push these discussions into the realm of identity and make them seem like they're simply an attack on people, and therefore try and redirect the very real struggles that people are having, you know, around their living standards into resentments around racial identity. I mean, I just find it fascinating that you're able to write a story called The War on the West at the time of an ongoing cost of living crisis in the West, and say that the giant war on the West is actually, you know, Black people talking about histories of slavery. It's not that you can't pay your bills every month because neoliberal economy has left you, you know, absolutely destitute, even if you're working every hour that God sends. It's not that precariety of employment means that you can't get a secure contract. You know, he would, in the book, I talk a little bit about the history of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is an old colonial company, and is of course now BP. You know, in the 21st century, in 2022, they are now a company that is benefiting from the cost of living crisis. The chief executive talks about how it's turned this company into a cash machine. You know, this is the kind of company that someone like a Douglas Murray or like Boris Johnson said in 2012, that these are British companies that we should feel proud of, we should feel patriotic about, and any attack on them is an attack on Britain. Well, they're not being very patriotic in 2022 when they lend pensioners free to death in their homes because they don't want to have a windfall tax that might take a tiny bit of their profits. And so I think when we're talking about a war on the West, I think he needs to talk a little bit about what's actually devastating people's lives in the West. And that automatically takes us back to the aftermath of empire.
And I think what it's really evident of as well is what Ash spoke of at the beginning, the misdirecting of like how race is used and has been used since its inception, since it's well, the idea of like a white race and a quote unquote Negro race, since its inception in, you know, colonial Barbados in the 17th century, it was actually, and has been used, mobilized so successfully since then to actually misdirect exploited and oppressed people's anger onto kind of racialized others, so they don't see the real source of their exploitation. And I think, yeah, that would just be kind of evident of that process, that phenomenon, you know, also being very present with us like now.
Thank you. And just on a really final note, and I want you to answer this in one sentence, if possible. I think a lot of our audience members will be thinking, okay, you've laid it all out. What can I do? And what you guys have all laid out is that this is about systems, and it's not about, you know, what we can necessarily do as individuals. But is there one thing that people can walk away thinking, I'm going to try and do that in one sentence, if at all possible? Emma, you start, and then Ash, then Kojo.
I think they should read this book. I can't see it, it's blurring. They should read Uncommon Wealth.
Read, I'll hold up my copy.
as a starting point, yeah.
Okay, all right, well, end it. One, Ash, did you go on?
I would say read Uncommon Wealth twice.
Okay.
I paid them to say this.
I just want to share one thing that someone in the audience has sent in. It's a Jubilee Action online workshop this Wednesday, 4:30, for artists, creatives and activists from the Advocates Network in Jamaica. We now ease up. And protest artist Rachel Reed will be there, and we can share the link to that afterwards. I'm so sorry that if I didn't get to your question, we have just had so much to say and it's a huge topic, but thank you so much for joining us. I really hope you enjoyed the discussion. We've been able to answer some of your questions. Please, we'd really love to hear what you thought of this event, unless they're kind of horrible comments about us or, you know.
I'm very sensitive. I will cry if you say anything nasty about me.
No, only joking. Please do send us your full and unfiltered, uncensored thoughts on what you thought about this evening. Always trying to improve. So please fill out the survey that will pop up at the end. And for more events from our brilliant Guardian Live team, please go to theguardian.com/Guardian Live. Thank you all very much for tuning in, and have a lovely evening, or wherever you are in the world. Enjoy the rest of your day.